Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks, hasn't it? I've missed you all. I've missed doing this because I do genuinely enjoy it. And it's been great as ever to see so many people already hanging out in the chat long before we ever came to air. So thank you very much to everybody. Let's say hello to a few. I trust you can all hear me because I definitely plugged it in. Did it, checked it, triple checked it. We're all good. So hello, everybody. Hello from Montreal. That is Mr. Beauregard. Hello from Norway, from Rasmus. Hi, mate. Boston, David Bigwood. Hello. Yes, everybody delighted that we got sound. Believe me, I'm delighted as well. Thank you all for tuning in. Hello, everybody. Hello, Christian from London. Hello from Slovenia. Pramarko. Hello. What a beautiful country you live in. I was, of course, in Slovenia for the last week and thoroughly enjoyed it. Great place. Hello from Nigeria. Hello, Coventry. We've got Margate here in the UK, Hertfordshire, California, Estonia, Utah, Brussels, Denmark. I love it. Argentina, the Netherlands, Germany. Wow, amazing, amazing. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. And well, I hope you enjoyed the British Grand Prix. It was, for a large spell in the middle of that race, thoroughly dull, if we're going to be really honest, wasn't it? It had... you know, Mercedes, look, let's face it, Mercedes have this championship in the bag, and there's no two ways to put that. There's nobody going to beat Mercedes, and they could even afford a DNF or two and still probably catch up and still win the championship with some ease, without really stretching themselves. And so once they got the start underway, Lewis, of course, in fact, Valtteri had a better start than Lewis, but Lewis managed to hang on. So once he was away, once he broke the DRS gap behind, they could just turn it down. And particularly once they had a safety car, everything was just wound straight back down. So there's no point in them stressing anything. So whatever unbelievable performance we see from Mercedes, I firmly believe that they've always still got something left in the tank if they ever needed it, and that's a scary prospect. So there we go. So once the race got underway, we knew it was going to be Lewis, Valtteri, and then Max Verstappen, didn't we? And then of course it all came to life. So we're going to start tonight's show by talking about the last laps, and that of course the tyre failures that affected the three cars that had the catastrophic failures, possibly others that had damage but didn't get to that catastrophic point. Started of course with Valtteri, and the point that I want to bring up before we get into your chat here is that everybody talks about there not being any warning when these tyres let go. And what I mean by that is, yes, we had Valtteri talking about vibrations, and if you look at Carlos Sainz's feedback after the race, he had vibrations, but actually much earlier in the race, nothing right before the tyre went. Lewis talked about the tyre feeling perfectly normal, the grip levels being normal. He was able to push and didn't feel anything untoward until the moment it went. So the actual warning of things letting go was very, very short, and that's the first point. We're going to talk about the various scenarios that could have played out, the things that could have been done differently, but let's just bring up the picture, because that of course is how things ended. Lewis winning the Grand Prix effectively on three wheels. That's how good that Mercedes is. They can do it on three wheels, which is just staggering. So let's take a few of your comments just on how the race ended, because I think it was one of the most dramatic finishes I can remember. I can't remember, maybe you can tell me, I can't remember a car finishing with just three inflated tyres on the car. Maybe it's happened in the past, I'm not sure. Lots of you are already talking about what the solution could be. So let's talk about that. This is your show, we'll be led by you. The solution, given that we're at Silverstone again a week later, with a softer range, one step softer of compounds in the tyre range. Now, the first thing to say is the fact that they're softer doesn't necessarily mean that the problem that we saw on Sunday is going to be that much worse just because the compounds are softer. That is the first thing. Having said that, the softer compounds will make the cars faster and therefore put more load through those tyres. And it's the fact that the reasons this happened, and given that we don't yet know if it was debris that caused the eventual failure or simply a tyre structural failure, but what we do know is the tyres were very much at the end of their life. The hard tyres, and unusually in this race, everybody pretty much went onto them at the same time because of the safety car early in the race. Did a very long stint, not though longer than Pirelli's recommendation. That's the first thing. Nobody, I think, exceeded that. Certainly nobody with a failure. But what happens is when you do get to the end of a tyre's life, which these tyres clearly were, which means although you can't see it on the TV, the tread depth has diminished down to its bare minimum. And therefore, I mean, if that was your road car on your tyre, you'd see the tread depth, the tread just disappear. And there'd be a massive warning sign saying, right, that's, you know, at the end of its life, that's dangerous now. On a Formula One tyre, you can see it because you have little indents in there for measuring, but not on the TV, not when the cars are going around the track. With no tread left on the tyre or very little tread, they are much more susceptible to a puncture if you make contact with debris or a sharp curb edge or something like that. So there is a very real possibility it could have been a combination of the two factors, the tyres being excessively worn and perhaps Pirelli underestimated just what the wear was going to be like, given that these cars are faster than anything we've seen, well, ever before in Formula One. The fact that we all went on to them much earlier than we perhaps thought and therefore ran them longer, and perhaps then they underestimated what those lap limits or the lap guidelines they give the teams should have been. So given all of that information, and that's without a conclusive report yet from Pirelli, where should we be going in a week's time? Lots of people have said we should scrap the softer range of tyres. I don't necessarily think that's the right way to go. If it was debris on the circuit, then there's a very clear solution. We should not be running cars with debris on a circuit. But let's see what some of you guys are saying. Let's see, it says here that seems that the failures were from cuts, debris off a broken front wing, says Sandy Barnes. Well, that is one very real possibility. Kimi had a very pretty serious front wing failure, which did leave a lot of debris. Sometimes debris you can't even see, but at the speeds they're going, even a driver may not be able to see it. It's very easy to cut a tyre. And like I say, when you've got no tread left on the tyre, they are more susceptible. And the other thing was, of course, everybody was running curbs. They were running off onto the dirt, if you remember, weren't they? Coming out of, where was it? As you come through the Maggots-Beckett's segment, and then you come out onto the straight, everybody was running the dirt, running over the curb. Now, those curbs have relatively sharp edges on them, and there will be a possibility that the left front dipped inside of that. So that could be another possibility. So yes, it could well have been debris, and therefore that would then throw the onus onto race control to be a bit more vigilant perhaps in terms of clearing the circuit when we have an incident like that. Antonio David says, with softer tyres for safety, mandate 2 pit stops. Now this is another one that lots of people have talked about, mandating 2 pit stops. There's two sides to that. First of all, it would definitely spice up spice up the strategy and change the race up from the one we just had. But to mandate 2 pit stops in the regulations, yeah, of course we can make changes, but that means changing the sporting regulations, which I'm sure could be done under the special circumstances if everybody was in agreement. The other way to do that is to mandate a maximum number of laps on each tyre, which would effectively then force a 2-stop strategy anyway. The reality is, I'm pretty sure you're not going to find many teams willing to take the risk, given the information we now have from the weekend just gone by, and I'm sure almost everybody will be doing at least 2 stops anyway. Very, very unlikely we'd see somebody push to the limits on these tyres for a 1 stop, knowing what we now know. So that's the first thing. So Pirelli give guidelines to the teams on how many laps they think each compound of tyre is safely able to do. Now, unfortunately, that's not an absolute rule. That's not a limit. You know, if you go over that, you're not breaching any regulations. If you go over that and you have a failure, it's clearly the team's fault because they didn't listen to Pirelli's advice. So Pirelli can give advice which will bring the lap limit down by quite a lot. It won't absolutely mandate 2 stops, but I think it'll have that effect, and I'm pretty sure that's probably the way that they will likely go anyway. And the lap limits will be different because of the softer range of tyres anyway. So that's that. We'll wait for a full report from Pirelli, of course, before we decide exactly what happened. Dave says, when the graphic said Hamilton on Bottas's onboard, I went nuts just for it to be a mistake. What a roller coaster of an ending. Yeah, I think you're right. Half the country did that. When poor old Crofty screamed that it was Hamilton, everybody went wild. Only to find that actually half a lap later, it actually was Hamilton. Those are a commentator's nightmare. You know, you quite often mix up a driver. It's very easy to do, particularly now with the halo. Really hard to spot a driver when you get a flash of a car, particularly after a crash or a quick onboard. When you do it and it's a really significant event like that and you've got it wrong, it's horrible. Right. Here we go, here's a good one. Georgina says, does the DAS increase the lateral load? So DAS, well, it doesn't increase any lateral load. Lots of people, though, have suggested, could DAS have played a part in this? I don't think so, is the short answer. Of course, it depends how aggressively. The thing with DAS, for those who don't know, is you can change the toe angle of the front tyres. I think most people know that now. Now, there are two things you could do with that. You can, given that a car is always running a little bit of toe out on the front end, with DAS you can straighten the tyres up, so you could take away that toe, and that would have the effect of potentially minimising any rolling resistance, perhaps a little aero advantage as well, but actually it can also help to minimise tyre temperature. If you think about the tyres being out like that, they're constantly scrubbing just by a tiny amount all the way around a lap. If you want to reduce that and therefore maybe reduce the front tyre temperature, you could use DAS to straighten up the tyres and therefore they wouldn't be scrubbing anymore and therefore you could minimise tyre temp. More commonly, what you need to do with front tyres on a Formula 1 car is actually increase tyre temp. So maybe behind safety cars, maybe on your out lap for a qualifying lap, what you might want to do is use DAS to put a bit more toe onto the car. And that could be more toe out or it could be an extreme version of toe in. Kind of doesn't really matter. It's about introducing more scrub onto those tyres, which means you're dragging them down the road, generating temperature. That's a really useful tool in managing your tyre temp. What it does or could have the effect of, if you used it over and over again, all the way round and round and round, of course you introduce excessive wear on those tyres. I don't believe that Mercedes will have been using DAS anywhere near to that extent during the race. I don't think they need to, first of all. They may have used it behind the safety car, I didn't actually see. But I can't see beyond that there was much cause for them to use that in any extreme manner that would have caused the tyres to have some unusual or excessive wear. And the fact that Carlos Sainz had a failure, and we now know that others were pretty close to that as well, points to the fact that it probably was nothing to do with DAS in the first place. Says, was Kvyat a tyre failure too? Yes, it was. You may have seen the pictures doing the rounds on social today, in that there's an onboard, a rearward facing onboard of Kvyat's tyre deflating before he got pitched into the spin. So as I think Brundle called out on commentary, and it was pretty clear in that the failure or the spin was such an unusual spin, such a quick snap, that it wasn't a driver error. It wasn't like he got on the throttle too quickly. It would never snap that quickly. It was the rear tyre deflating very quickly. Obviously that was on the right hand side, so unrelated, I would imagine, to the extreme wear that the front left sees around a circuit like Silverstone that's many, many right hand corners. If Max stays out and has a tyre failure, we could have had Ham on Max with 3 tyres, each battling on the last lap. Brilliant, sprinter man. Somebody said this to me earlier. How funny would that have been if Max had not made his pit stop and had opted to go to the end, been closing Lewis down, then Lewis has his failure, he's hobbling around the last lap on three tyres, and then Max has the same failure. And can you imagine this scenario where they're both racing each other, hobbling round on 3 tyres, barely able to control it? It would have been hilarious. It would have been brilliant. And this brings up the question then of, did Max do the right thing in making his pit stop to go for fastest lap, and I firmly believe that I would have done exactly the same. I think he did do the right thing. I think they had concerns over their own tyres, as everybody did. They all knew they were near the limit, and the fact that Bottas's tyre let go was a big warning sign to everybody just how close to the limit all of these tyres were. So if I was sitting on the pit wall at Red Bull, I think I'd have done exactly the same. There was no actual sign that Lewis's tyre would, was going to let go. There was a risk, but equally there was just as much risk that Max's could have let go too. And I think there was no way they were going to catch Lewis on pure pace alone had nobody's tyre let go. Therefore, it made perfect sense for them to take the risk-averse option, make sure they get it to the end, bag the extra point for fastest lap, and they executed that perfectly. Almost got them the win, but not quite. It's easy to look back with hindsight and say, well, look, Lewis did have the failure. Maybe if Max hadn't made the stop, he could have won the race. Maybe, but maybe Max would have had the failure and perhaps Lewis wouldn't. So there's so many scenarios that could have played out with hindsight. It's easy to look at it and say they made the wrong call. Personally, I say they made the right one. The next question then is, did Lewis make the right call in not making a pit stop, given that when Max made his stop, he had about a 35-second gap over Max back in second and could have made a free pit stop if they were that concerned and come out and just done his final lap to the flag. There's that one. I personally think they could have done that. Perhaps with hindsight they should have done that, but I think in reality what they were thinking was, look, we're so close to the end here, we've already got a substantial gap, we think we're safer just to keep going. Don't introduce the risk of a pit stop, just keep going, just nurse it to the end. We've got a comfortable lead, and that's the method, that's the option they went for. I can totally understand taking that option. It's easy to now, as I say, look back and say maybe they should have made that split-second call to dive in the pits, but I think either way they were going to win that race. Yes, it was dramatic in the way they did it, and it gave Max a little bit of a carrot dangling in front of him, but still they got to the end and made it work. So all was well for them. Somebody asked me earlier, yeah, Lewis didn't have new tyres, Corolla says. Didn't really matter whether it was new tyres or not. He had a lap or two to go. It was just a case of putting different tyres on if they were concerned about the hards failing. It wasn't about going for fastest lap at that point. It was just about getting to the end safely. Toto said they should have pitted Lewis. Yeah, I think, as I say, with hindsight, probably that would have been the safer option, was to just make a pit stop, get back out and cruise to the finish. But look, they won the race. Difficult to criticise too much. Now, just before we move on to a few people asking about Albon, I will pick up on Albon in a moment. Just want to pick up on this one that somebody mentioned to me on Twitter earlier. I'm going to bring up a picture here of Silverstone because somebody said to me, could Lewis on the last lap have not gone through that final section of corners but actually just gone into the pit lane? And the answer to that is yes, he could. So here is a map of Silverstone. You can quite clearly see there in the pit lane entrance. Just after you come through Stowe, the pit lane entrance there on the right hand side before you get to the Vale Club chicane. You could go in there and you will cross the finish line. And the point there is, what he could have done is finish the race in the pits. That's perfectly allowed. The finish line, or the control line, runs across the start-finish straight. That's where the checkered flag comes out. But it extends, deliberately so, to cross at exactly the same point into the pit lane. He could have done that. He could have saved himself an extra few corners. I just think they probably didn't think of it, first of all. And I also think there would have been a concern over just how slow he would have had to go. Bear in mind, Max was bearing down on him. Of course, you're at the pit lane speed limit once you cross the pit lane entry line, which is before the finish line. So you'd have to go at pit lane speed for quite some way of that pit lane entry. But I do think that it would have still been, he would have lost less time, of course, going into the pit lane, given that he was going relatively slowly anyway. But I just think it was one of those where they were probably weighing that up in the moment. And actually, Lewis had what turns out to be reasonable pace on 3 tyres, and that was probably the safer option to get round. One thing that it did throw up in my mind was, if you just bring that up again, Actually, I wonder, I mean, I'll have to work this out looking at some of the onboards and timing it myself, I guess, but I wonder how close it is to completing a lap by going through the pit lane as opposed to going through this last section of Vale and Club and then back onto the straight. I'm not suggesting that anybody should perhaps try and do that to save some lap time, and clearly I'm sure it isn't the case, but it must be relatively close. Although you're at pit lane speed limit, you are cutting out 2 or 3 of the final corners of the lap. There we go. Anyway, all right, let's move on. Max should have finished in the pits. Well, Max would have lost a lot more time by going into the pits, of course, because he had a car running at full speed, and therefore the difference between running at full speed and going into the pit lane speed limit is much more severe than Lewis would have had with his car running at half speed going into the pit lane speed limit zone as well. So there would have been a difference. Max was absolutely flying, and I think his best option was just to go for it. But there we go, interesting points. Let's talk about, in fact, before we move on, there were a couple of questions here. One about, well, let's bring up this one from Nate Smith, because it's sort of what we've just been talking about here. But he says, do you think we're simply at the limit of what these current Pirellis can do? They were designed in 2018 at a time when the prediction was that the 2019 front wings would lose about 2 seconds a lap. Here we are in 2020 with a Marc that's off those charts. Really good point, and that is exactly why Pirelli have had this, not in reaction to this weekend, but they've had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to the pace of the current cars, in that they are testing some new tyres this coming weekend at Silverstone for the 2021 season, for that exact reason, that they know that the cars are just getting faster and faster, and even though we've got a change to the floors next year to drop a load of downforce off deliberately to try and slow them down and minimise the loads on these tyres that were, you're right, designed back in 2018, Pirelli are still concerned that given the rate of development already, we still might see loads that are far greater than the tyres were ever intended for. So, Nate, I think you've got a very good point. We are seeing cars that are faster than anybody predicted, especially Pirelli, when these tyres were designed. It's unheard of to see a tyre last, or have to last, for 3 seasons as they were originally intended to. So I think that's exactly why Pirelli are looking a little bit twitchy now, and maybe we'll bring in something new. And in the first half hour of FP2, next weekend at Silverstone, all teams will be testing this new unmarked tyre with a view to signing it off for next year. So there's that one. Now I want to bring up this one, because on the same sort of subject, Geordie139 says, I noticed a lot of yellow dust coming off Hamilton's car on the last lap. Could the stewards be arses and penalise him for excessive plank wear? They would be arses if they did that. No, and before I answer it, I'm just going to bring up this one here, because on a very similar note, Freak van der Ven says, after a race, drivers always pick up rubber, and it's to make sure they're within the minimum height of the car. It's also to pick up weight as well, in a similar way. What if Hamilton's car measures too low with his puncture in the end? Well, both of those questions are both easily answered in that the stewards always will take into account race damage. It's just like if you've lost a barge board during a race, your car, will be under the weight limit. But all you do is you add the weight of a barge board to that car. And the stewards have to understand that there's clearly a reason why the car's underweight. When we add the weight of a barge board back, it becomes back overweight again, and exactly the same will happen. There's clearly a very obvious cause for Lewis's plank wear, or for his car failing any sort of minimum height check. So I think that's just what the stewards take, a common sense view in those kind of incidents where there's a very clear and obvious cause. Then that's generally okay. Right, let's move on. We got this one here, says, Hemant Patel, I'll come to Albon in a moment. Hemant Patel, what happened to Hulkenberg? What happened to his car? Why didn't it start up? How gutted were we all for Nico Hulkenberg? I mean, as it turned out, the Racing Point was disappointingly slow this weekend. I think we all thought they were in with a proper chance of maybe a podium. Could this have been the opportunity for Hulkenberg to get his podium. I did a video today on sort of how they got Hulkenberg fitted into that car at such short notice. Apologies for it being in mono sound. I've got no idea how or why that happened. I couldn't fix it because unfortunately it was a recording issue rather than a YouTube issue. So apologies for that, but still, if you want to listen to it in one ear, it might be worth checking out. Hulkenberg's car didn't start because there was a broken bolt jammed inside the clutch housing, which physically stopped the engine from turning over and therefore from firing up. Now, that's unheard of. That is like an unprecedented failure, really. I mean, one of those things that the cars come apart on a Friday night completely. So the gearbox comes off after Friday running. The clutch will come off. The race gearbox and clutch will go on Friday night. Now, normally, unless you have some kind of problem, it won't come apart again. I mean, the gearbox comes off and ratios are checked and all those things, but normally you wouldn't take the clutch off again during Friday. So after FP3, you put it on Friday night, that should then run through the weekend. So some things happened and somehow it managed to get through FP3, and then a broken bolt or a piece of a bolt or something like that, which I can only assume has come undone and then been sheared off by the clutch housing, has found its way somewhere where it's literally prevented the engine from turning over at the start of the race. And it's not just that is an unlucky failure in itself, but the engine clearly started on all the fire-ups on Sunday morning, of which there would have been a number of. It got to the one where they had to start it up to go to the grid, and presumably that little bolt had found its way into a position that literally would stop the engine physically turning, and therefore they couldn't start it. I would imagine that once the engine's fired up, even if, and this is probably what happened on the other occasions, even if that little broken piece of bolt is flailing around in the bottom of the clutch housing, with the engine going at speed, it was highly unlikely probably that it would have found its way into to actually cause a similar kind of failure. It may have caused some kind of failure, but you know, they'd have got the engine started, they'd have got going. It sounds like this piece had fallen into a place, you know, probably a 1 in a million chance where it literally got wedged and they couldn't get it started. So, I mean, an awful situation for Hulkenberg, not only because he was desperate to get racing, but, you know, the data and the knowledge and the learning that he would have gained over a 52-lap race on Sunday, ahead of what will almost certainly be another 52-lap race for him this coming week, unless they can get Checo back in the car, would have been so valuable. And you know, not only that, but building his neck muscles up. The best way to do that is actually race a Formula One car. So he's missed out massively there. And if the team need to use him again this weekend, well, unfortunately the team have missed out on gathering all that information too. So a real shame, bit of a heartbreaker, that one. Let's see. Russell should have been in the Racing Point. Well, whether it was Russell or Hulkenberg, he still wouldn't have started the race with that problem that they had. I don't know, I'm not sure. I think Russell, it would have been pretty harsh on Williams to somehow try and drag him out of a Williams contract. Claire's already been adamant, you know, they want to keep him. He's contracted for next year and they want him to see that contract out. And I can understand that. He is probably the guy within that team. In fact, he is definitely the guy within that team that's leading the team and probably leading the development as well, even though he's so inexperienced. So harsh to pull him out of Williams to put him into Racing Point. Sabotage, says Sabotage for beating Stroll. Yeah, not sure. Hoping that Hulkenberg gets a chance, says Lance. Yeah, absolutely. Hulkenberg said that these marbles are hurting my head. These knobbles are hurting my head. Don't get that one, sorry. Why is one driver penalised for driving on with a punctured tyre, i.e. rubber debris, but another is not? Okay, let's talk about that. So I don't know if you've got an exact example there, but the point you're making is some drivers, if they've got bits flying off their car, will be told to come in, or if they don't come in, will get black flags, and rightly so. I think the point with both Valtteri and with Lewis is that they weren't flailing bits off the car. They were both incredibly lucky that the carcass of the tyre remained attached. It was sort of held in place by the sidewall. So the carcass stayed attached to the rim, and the uprights, if you like, the sides of the tyre stayed in place, which held the tread in between the two. And that meant that luckily, first of all, the tread didn't fly off, but then when it didn't fly off, it didn't start smashing the wing to pieces that you often see at the rear of the car. And at the rear of the car, when that happens, it's much more likely you're going to get bits flying everywhere because the floor is so much closer to the tyre itself. Of course, the front tyre has a lot more space around it, and that can therefore deal with a bit of flailing rubber without causing too much of a drama. Right, let's talk about Albon. I want to talk about that because a few of you mentioned it already. What did you think of Albon's penalty? I will throw it open to you. Did you think it was a fair penalty? Do you think it was harsh? I mean, there have been so many incidents already in just these first 4 races that have seemed similar in some ways, that seemingly have been inconsistently dealt with from the stewards. Let's see if any of you are wading in on that one. What do you think of Albon's penalty? Who's going to replace Albon, says Polsitter. We'll maybe get to that in a moment if we have time. Harsh, says Lawrence van der Broel. Racing incident, says Adam Elliott. I agree with both of you. I thought it was harsh that he got a penalty. And the main reason, Neil Williams says fair. Fran7 says harsh. So I think it's one of those that split opinion. And I guess when you get one of those that splits opinion down the middle, it's difficult to argue with whichever way the stewards fall, because, you know, if half the audience think one thing and half the audience think another, probably the stewards are never going to please everybody. My take on that was that Magnussen had made a fairly major mistake. He'd essentially run off. I know he didn't quite go off the circuit, but he'd run off. He clipped the curb too heavily, launched himself well out wide. The gap was wide open, and Albon went for it. Now, I don't think at that point there was anything wrong with Albon going for that gap. I think what Albon did wrong, and this is going to sound strange, but whilst he was in that point alongside Magnussen, as Magnussen had closed up, Albon backed out of it. And he backed out of it so abruptly that actually when he pulled backwards, it was his front tyre that collided with the right rear of Magnussen's, and that's where the collision came. I think if Albon had kept his foot in, they'd have both gone around the corner. Yeah, they may well have touched, but I think they'd have probably both got through. And it was that abrupt lifting off the throttle which caused the collision, and maybe the stewards looked at that as perhaps their reasoning, but it was a racing incident for me. I'm always not too sure about stewards penalising every time a car touches. I just don't think it should do that. I think, and also, you know, as we've talked about before, penalising the outcome rather than the incident. Because for me, that's the sort of thing you want we want to be encouraging racing drivers to go for a gap like that, because it can create exciting racing. Now, if somebody touches and they go on the outside spins, and we get a penalty every single time, well then you're not going to encourage people to go for that, and you're going to get drivers backing out, being hesitant, not making those lunges that make the racing exciting. What do you think? Harsh but fair, says Varun Sambi. They would have both crashed. Well, look, we don't know what the outcome could have been. If Albon had kept his foot in and Magnussen hadn't given him a bit more space, maybe there'd have been a collision. Who knows? There was a collision, and I think the reason it happened, I'm not saying Albon was right or wrong, but the reason it happened was that sudden backing off and the sudden closing speed as Albon backed off. Magnussen kept his foot in, and that was the problem on that one, I think. Let's talk about Albon then while we're on that subject, because who is it here then? I Lube, do you really? Says Max and Leclerc sold to one, will catch Lewis. Solid, said to one, will catch the Lewis in the Oh, I've missed it. Sorry, that comment's gone. Sorry, man, I apologise. Here we go. Sean Burns. If Albon doesn't back out, you'd have to expect him to turn. If Albon doesn't back out, you'd have to expect Magnussen hits him. Does Magnussen get penalised? So if Albon doesn't back out, Magnussen hits him. Yeah, it's one of those, isn't it? I still say racing incident. If Albon had kept his foot in, if they'd gone around the corner together and made contact, for me it's a really close one. But Albon was well alongside, and if you are going to penalise someone at that point of the corner, probably it would have been Magnussen in my view. Anyway, we've dealt with that. Let's talk about Albon and his Red Bull future, if you like, because it's got to be talked about. You know, how much patience are Red Bull going to have with him? What do you think? I think they're being very patient right now, and I think part of that is that they were so behind the decision to put him in the car and then give him another year this year, i.e. put their confidence in him. I think at least at Christian Horner's level, he's reluctant to criticise him. They're trying to keep him up, keep his confidence from going too low. But every time he has another disappointment, his confidence will be taking more and more of a hit. And of course, people, like we are now, I'm afraid, start talking about him. Red Bull have a car that is clearly the second fastest car. On occasions, as we saw at the weekend, able to pick up, you know, a second place. Maybe on another day, he could have picked up a win. Alex Albon is nowhere near fighting for those opportunities at the moment. And from a Red Bull perspective, you need two drivers. If you want to bring home, maybe a Constructors' Championship this year is out of the question anyway, but, you know, they need to cement second place. They need to make sure that they're not going to slip. They need to, you know, as it happens, the third best team in, you know, in Racing Point or Ferrari or McLaren, those kind of guys, well, they keep slipping up and having failures themselves. So they've got a little bit of breathing space. But they need Alex Albon to be there alongside Max Verstappen. At the moment, he just can't get it. They brought a new engineer in, race engineer, to try and bring that relationship, make that a bit more fruitful. And that will take time. There's no way you can expect immediate results from that. So I hope they do give him more time. I think he's a great driver. I think he's got plenty of talent. He just needs a break. He needs to gain his confidence. And actually that could happen in one race. One good race could turn the fortunes of a drive around, because your confidence changes and you take that into the upcoming event. So let's hope he can have a much better one this weekend, but he certainly isn't comfortable with that car, is he? It started, did it start when Albon crashed in practice, Varun Sambi? Yeah, that's the sort of thing that happens, particularly around a high-speed circuit like Silverstone, where a driver's confidence is everything. You've got to have confidence when you're turning it into a corner that seems to defy physics, and you're relying on the car being planted to hold you and stop you spitting you off the side of the racetrack. That comes from confidence, which you build up over the race weekend, and denting it, like with a spin or with a crash, can set you back massively. It's the same kind of thing at Monaco. It really has a huge impact on performance as the weekend goes on. It's the Red Bull second seat curse, says Josh Smith. Yeah, it's not been good, has it? And actually, since Daniel Ricciardo left, I think Red Bull will be realising just what he brought them. You know, maybe the relationship wasn't always as harmonious as it could be, but they had two cars that were always there or thereabouts. They had a really strong driver lineup, and they haven't yet found a solid enough replacement for him. This is kind of making Daniel Ricciardo look pretty good right now, isn't it? I mean, he is pretty good. Did a great job at the weekend, but this is all kind of showing just what a great job Daniel was doing for the team. Max will crush all his teammates. Well, we'll see. I mean, he is an incredibly good driver. There is absolutely no question about that. And just like with Lewis in a team like Mercedes, he's been there now for a long time. The team is kind of, even if not on the outside, it's centred around him. He's their long-term star. You know, he's the guy that they want to win this championship. Yeah, they need someone to back him up, but that in itself, knowing that this is Max's team or this is Lewis's team, can sometimes just be the difference between that second driver, even if he's not called the second driver, even if he doesn't have number 2 status in his contract. That just knowing what everyone's thinking about Max being in this team can sometimes be enough to just bring you down a peg and dent your own confidence and prevent you getting maybe the very best out of yourself over the course of a season, that is. Danny Rick, the most underrated driver in F1, says Chris Thiel. Yeah, he's an incredibly... I'm not sure he's underrated, to be fair. I think he's very highly rated. It's a real shame to see him struggling in the Renault, but look what he did at the weekend. I thought he did an amazing job. He still got it. He's still got that fight, that determination. He's still got the wheel-to-wheel skills. And you know, I'm looking forward to seeing him in a McLaren next year. Russell to Red Bull. I can't see him leaving the Mercedes program to go to Red Bull. I don't think it would make too much sense for him. Yes, he gets a better car, but I still think Russell is the next in line in succession, if you like, at Mercedes. My view on this would be that they're going to give Bottas another year next year. Lewis is about to sign a 3-year contract. It would make sense to me after that, give Russell 1 more year at Williams, bring him into Mercedes alongside Lewis to learn the ropes for 2 years, and then he becomes team leader at Marc, at the pace setting, at the class leading team. And you know, anything can happen, of course, in the new regs in 2022, but the team that's best placed to deal with those are the class leading outfit in Mercedes. You've got everything in place to carry on their domination of the sport. Why would Russell not want to hang on for that? Jerome Bowen says, stop watching F1 as long as the Mercs are running off. I hope I'm understanding this right, Jerome. If you're saying that it's becoming boring because Mercedes are disappearing into the distance, I understand that concern, but this is an ongoing debate, isn't it? This is the fault of every other team in Formula One. This is not the fault of Mercedes. It's the fault of everyone else who hasn't done a good enough job. Ferrari have easily as much money, if not more money, than Mercedes. Red Bull, equally, got everything they need. Everything they could wish for, they have at those teams to deliver a car that should be as quick, if not able to fight on days being quicker than Mercedes. Mercedes haven't got anything special. They haven't got anything that the other teams don't have. They've just built a team that's been incredibly successful. And I have to respect that. I'm in awe of what they've achieved. Having been in a Formula One team constantly striving for that, they've done an incredible job. So it's the job of all the other teams to find a way to catch up. And I appreciate that that's clearly not going to happen overnight. And we're going to see dominance this year, definitely dominance next year from Mercedes. 2022, of course, gives the others an opportunity as a bit of a reset to find a chance to catch up. Right, let's see what time we got here. Okay, we're all right, we're good. Let's bring up this next question from Phil Crawford, who says, wondering what checks discover a hairline crack in an F1 chassis. Now, I'm bringing that up because if you remember, Daniel Ricciardo his team found a hairline crack in his chassis on Friday night and had to break the curfew whilst they built up a spare chassis for him to use on Saturday morning. It's the very last thing you want to find as a mechanic. Building a chassis up from scratch is a long, big job. There is no way you get it done by the time curfew kicks in. I've had it myself. If you've read my book, you will know the story. Because often it's the last thing you find, and I don't know exactly how they found it, but the checks that can discover this, the way we found ours, was that the last thing you do on a Friday night is wheel your car, having taken it apart, put it back together, fired it up, set it up, wheel it down to the FIA garage at the end of the pit lane and put it onto the FIA flat patch, which is where they do all their legality checks. And then we go, as a team, we go around the whole thing, measuring everything to convince ourselves that it's obviously legal. When we did it, we found some of those measurements were weirdly out. Kind of front and rear ride heights were weirdly wrong, despite we knew they'd been set correctly. And so, having not been able to find anything, we brought the car back to the garage, pulled all the insides apart, and during those checks, actually found a visual crack, very small, underneath the seat and some of the electrical boxes, which you'd have never found if you hadn't been specifically looking for it. And then we were into another chassis change. What you can do, there are various ways, non-destructive testing they call it, which can be NDT. It can be done in a couple of ways. So ultrasonic testing, there are machines that can bounce ultrasonic waves over carbon fibre, which will then pull back or show up on a display a kind of map, if you like, of the internals of a piece of carbon, and they can show any imperfections or cracks or anything that may be wrong. So that's one thing, and the other is the old UV lights, where you spray UV a fluorescent spray or fluid over a component. You then clean it off and you go over it with a UV light, and it shows up where that fluid has seeped into, sometimes just a hairline crack. That's another way of doing it. So I don't know exactly which method they use, how they found it, whether they just saw it or whether they had to use some kind of NDT to find it. But however you find it, I promise you, it's the last thing you want to find, because it takes, I don't know, it's probably a good 5 or 6 hour job minimum to build up a chassis from scratch, and that's before you start then you know, engines and setups and getting the driver kit in, and it's a nightmare, believe me. Let's see, got one more question. Let me quickly pick up on this one from John, who says, what a race, but I'm surprised that Kvyat's car was losing its wheel. The tether let go, yet no one made mention of these tethers. Good thing the wheel did not roll back into traffic. Should we be concerned? Okay, good point, John. In fact, there were 2 incidents, because I think, didn't we get another wheel come off on another car? Can't remember. I think I remember seeing that. So tethers are something that are mandated by the FIA. We know that there are now 2 on each wheel. Every car has to have 2. They're a sort of standard part. They have to come from one of 2 suppliers. So generally one runs along the top wishbone, one runs along the bottom. They're attached to the upright. They are incredibly strong. They have to withstand load. They're made of Xylon, which is almost like a rope of numerous fibres. They can stand incredible loads. However, they can't stand all loads, and actually what tends to happen whenever you get a major crash where a wheel does detach, it's often because the upright has broken, so the point where it's attached is broken rather than the actual tether breaking. So they're tested to extremes. What they often do, and I think what happened at the weekend, was they minimise the energy that is dissipated through the wheel when it's attached. But at some point it may just break the fixings on the upright, or even at the other end on the chassis, if it's a massive, massive impact. And there's very little we can do about that. So the tethers are there to minimise the effects of a big crash like that, to try and stop accidents from happening. But we will never be able to, because you can't simulate every single accident, or every time a suspension component twists, bends, mangles that tether as it goes through this massive impact. So many scenarios that can mean a wheel can detach. We just hope, as happened at the weekend, that the tether does its job and stops it detaching with a huge amount of energy still stored up in it. That's the idea. So I don't think we need to be overly concerned. Yes, they will probably look at it and find out exactly what happened, but you can't protect against every single thing. Right, let me see. I want to quickly talk about this, because this, of course, is back. We have another Renault, again on exactly the same subject, the Racing Point brake ducts. Unsurprising that we saw that protest again, because they kind of have to. They've protested it and questioning whether it's legal on one race. They have to now keep that going until we get a result. But interestingly today, Ferrari have waded in as well, and Ferrari have asked the FIA for clarification on how on earth, they say, the Racing Point can be legal. And they particularly questioned how, when the FIA went to Racing Point pre-season to have a look and inspect and look at the way they were designing their car, they came away from that saying things look fine. Ferrari is saying, how can it be? The rules state you have to design your own components, and yet Racing Point are saying they've copied components from another team. The question in all of this, and we should get a ruling on Wednesday, or certainly we're going to get the hearing, I think, on Wednesday this week. The question this is going to come down to is what constitutes design? Who owns the design? Who actually designed it? Have you designed it if you've looked at a bunch of drawings or photos, if you have taken those into your own factory and then drawn out on the computer your own version of that, even if it's the same or very similar? I mean, if you look at these, they're not the same. This is the part in question, of course, the brake duct, together with the rear brake duct. You can clearly see from that there are differences. They may be tiny, they may be subtle. The design is obviously very, very similar. One is clearly inspired by the other, but, I mean, even I can see, just looking at that, there are going to be some dimensional differences. The measurements won't necessarily add up. There are some differences. So the question is that your design? If you've taken someone else's design, put it into your own CAD, done it yourself, maybe tweaked a couple of things, have you designed that? Or did Mercedes design the component and you have then just brought it into your system and maybe tweaked a little bit? That's going to be what this comes down to. You know, the rules state you have to design it, but what constitutes design? I talked before about how the precedent for this back in 1978 with arrows and shadows Shadow, that came down in a court of law. That one went to the UK Court of Law, saying that the car that was deemed to be a copy was more than 70% the same as the car that it was deemed to have copied from, and in that case, that 70% set a precedent saying it's not your design. Now, we could probably go across the grid and say everybody's front wing is 70% the same as everyone else's. So I don't think that necessarily applies today, but it's going to be a really interesting outcome. And the reason it's so interesting is it can shape the future of Formula One, particularly at a time when the Concord agreements, the commercial agreements, are at the point where they're about to be signed across Formula One. Now, nobody is going to sign that agreement until we get the outcome of this hearing on Wednesday, because it can change the shape of the way the sport moves forward. Essentially, if they deem the Racing Point to be legal, in as many words, we're allowing customer cars. Now, it's not quite that clear cut, but that's essentially what we're saying. You can take somebody else's design, as long as you sketch it out yourself, as long as you put it into your CAD system and you produce your own bits, we're saying, the FIA would be saying, it's your car now. You've designed it, it's yours. That's fine. If they say that this is illegal and actually the Racing Point is not been designed by Racing Point but by Mercedes, well, okay, that sets the clarification moving forward. It'll be a horrific situation for Racing Point because they haven't got a plan B here. They haven't got a backup car sitting there waiting to go. They'll be excluded from the previous 3 rounds. That's the Austrian Grand Prix, Styria, and of course Silverstone. No, sorry, Styrian Grand Prix, Hungarian Grand Prix, and Silverstone. And they won't have anything to be able to move forward with, because although this protest is about brake ducts, if they were to change a brake duct, for example, moving on to the next race in Spain, the protest would simply move to another component on the car. So this is a much bigger, much more fundamental problem. Let's see what some of you guys are saying. Surprise Ferrari are asking for clarification, unless it's clarification for what else can be shared with Haas. Well, that's a big part of it, absolutely. And this is why some teams want clarification, because they want to know if they can copy the Mercedes, because that seems like a quick, relatively easy and inexpensive way to leap up the grid. For others, it might be like Ferrari, it might be, well, how much of our car can we offer to Haas and bring them up the grid? So there are definitely 2 sides of this. It's just clarification. The protest is about clarification. And actually, to answer lots of your questions that you've said to me on social media, this protest is not sour grapes from Renault. This is literally about getting clarification on how we move forward. And it's the midfield teams, it's the Renaults, it's the McLarens, it's of course the Racing Point and others, and of course the sort of sister teams like a Haas, like a Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri. Those teams will stand to change their business model going forward, dependent on the outcome of this hearing. So it's really significant, and they're all going to be waiting on it. Can they run the previous year's car, says Aussie. Could they run last year's car? What's changed? That's a good point. Can they run last year's car? I can't remember if anything like crash testing regulations changed between last year and this. Tell me, YouTube. I can't remember. Mine's gone blank. Has anything changed between this year and last year that's that significant? You'll let me know. I'll come back to that one. Where is the limit? That's always going to be a massive sticking point, says Anthony Featherstone. Well, that's it. And this is the other part of this, isn't it? Because if you're going to frown upon Racing Point, which lots of the paddock are, they are not looking lightly and kindly towards Racing Point on this. They think some people think this is terrible what they've done. They think it's cheap. It's not the way Formula One should be run. And yet every one of those teams has their own photographers commissioned to go up and down the pit lane every weekend, snapping photos of whichever component that team wants a really close look at. I know because we've done it at McLaren, every team's doing it. And when they get those photos, they're looking at those designs and they're taking those as inspiration at the very least to move forward with their own designs. You know, if it was the double diffuser, when someone came up with this brilliant thing of a double diffuser, others looked at it and thought, right, we need that on our car. We'll go and come up with our own version. May not have been dimensionally exact, but they copied it from another team. And I think that happens all the way through history, and it will continue to happen. How are you going to stop that? How are you going to, if we say this is illegal, how far does it go? Exactly as Anthony says there, where is the line drawn? Are you going to look at two front wings and say, hang on, that front wing's the same as this one? Who had it first? It's a minefield. So a lot riding on this decision or this hearing on Wednesday, and I'm really interested, as everyone is, to find the outcome for so many reasons. Should we just allow customer cars? That's another big question, which lots of people have brought up. I don't really understand how they can expect us to sympathise that much when they all copy and Racing Point just did it better. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. They are all copying, aren't they? It's just that Racing Point copied a lot more and have been pretty open about it. You know, whenever a team copies a front wing or a rear wing, very rarely does a team come out and go, well, we saw Red Bull with it, so we thought we'd have one. They don't do that. They say it's something they've been working on for months in the wind tunnel, blah, blah, blah. Racing Point have come out and said, look, we needed a way to jump up the grid. The class leading car was the Mercedes. We saw, you know, got a huge amount of information from photos and photogrammetry. We had access to some of their components last year because we bought them. We already used their gearbox, their suspension. It makes perfect sense, but Racing Point have been very open and honest about what they've done. That's perhaps one of the biggest differences. Right, we're coming to the end, aren't we? What time is it? Yeah, 5 minutes. All right, I'll give it 5 minutes. Does this year's engine fit into last year's car? Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that. Probably not, but it may well be that you could mash up the two. I don't know the answers to that, whether they could use last year's car. My gut instinct would say no, because it's very rare that that's possible. But don't forget, they are using, I don't know what the big differences are in terms of packaging around the power unit. That would be the biggest thing, probably, is packaging around the power unit. Either way, it wouldn't be the job of 5 minutes. And I think, my feeling on this is this: if this falls on the side of Renault and Racing Point, you know, are effectively thrown out the last 3 races, found to be illegal. Of course, at the moment, they would only be found to be illegal when it comes to brake ducts. Then it depends how much, if that precedent they're setting with this hearing, does it fall across the rest of the car? Are there more areas of the car that Renault or others would then seek to protest because they say they are so similar? That's I guess the big question, because if there are more of those areas, if the chassis, for example, is so similar, we deem that to be a copy as well and therefore illegal, well, they're screwed. And in my mind, they would start focusing very quickly on next year, because this year would be a write-off, in my very quick snap opinion on this, without having any of the details, of course. There we go. Let's see what else you're saying as we finish up. Next weekend will be spicy. Imagine a 3-stop working, says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, J, H, I, J, K, L, M, N. Great YouTube name, thank you very much. Next weekend, let's quickly round up on that then. I think we're going to get a good one. Temperatures are going to be really hot, much hotter. Now, the media are all going to start saying the temperatures are hotter. This is going to peg Mercedes back and bring Red Bull much closer to them. No, it's not. And I mean, yes, it is, but not to a point where we're suddenly going to see a Red Bull challenging a Mercedes for the race win. Mercedes have so much in hand, you know, they can run around on 3 wheels and win the race. The temperatures are going to be really hot, and that will, Mercedes so far have struggled a little bit more on the hotter temperatures. But bear in mind, we had those hotter temperatures on Friday at Silverstone. Mercedes don't ever run their car wound up on a Friday. You know, they are toying with people on a Friday. There's no need to turn it up. They've probably got, you know, half a second, 3/4 of a second in hand, just in turning things up between a Friday and a Saturday. So whilst it may have looked like they were struggling a bit more in the hotter temperatures, and I think they were to some extent, I don't think that they need to be in any way concerned that someone else is going to suddenly pose a major threat to them. It may well help the likes of Red Bull, who seem to be slightly more comfortable on that. But of course, we've got a different range of tyres, and we still got to find out the outcome of this whole Pirelli investigation. So I think there's a lot to look forward to for the second Silverstone round, the 70th anniversary. The hashtag for this event, by the way, hashtag F170, I found out today. I was wondering what that might be. So plenty to look forward to. I'm really excited about it. I'm going to be commentating this weekend, I mentioned it before, alongside Jolyon Palmer for the BBC. So looking forward to that. I've done that a few times in the past, and it's great, always great to do that with Jolyon. I think we're going to be in separate studios because of social distancing, but looking at each other through the glass probably. So you can check that out on the BBC radio channels, 5 Live. But yeah, loads of questions to be answered. I don't think there's any danger we're going to get just more of the same. I think there's going to be so many variables, tyres being the main one, but temperatures as well. And of course, we've got the outcomes to the Racing Point hearing. We've got Sergio Perez's COVID test on Thursday that may allow him to come back into the paddock, or maybe not. We still don't know who'll be driving that car. We've got the outcome of Pirelli's investigation to know what on earth we'll be doing with tyres and what we might expect. And then the teams have to factor all of that Pirelli information, whether it's lap limits, the new tyres, more pit stops. It's going to be a very different race, and I think could be a brilliant one. I love the Silverstone circuit. So I hope you enjoy it wherever you're watching. I appreciate you all joining tonight. Really great to have so many people on. I love these conversations. I'm sorry you missed it the last couple of races, but glad to have you all back. And I hope we can do it again next week. I will see you all very, very soon. Thank you, folks. Peace out.